The drawing room at Hartwell House held perhaps 30 people that afternoon, and not one of them heard it happen. Later, when it had become the sort of story that London could not stop telling, altered, embroidered, improved upon until the original was nearly lost, at least a dozen would claim they had been standing close enough to hear every word. Lord Drayton, who actually had been close enough, would say only that it happened between one sip of tea and the next, and that he had never in his life seen Hadrian Dacre move so quickly toward anything. But it began with nothing. A conversation, the kind that forms at the edges of rooms when the principal performers have exhausted themselves and the rest are left to find their own entertainment. Catherine Wren, Kitty, as her sister called her, and as he would come to call her, though not yet, not for another 3 hours, was sitting beside a window with a cup of tea she had not touched, speaking to Mrs. Palliser about the weather in Hertfordshire, with the gentle, unforced attention of a woman who did not require the room to notice her. Hadrian had not intended to sit down. He had not intended to speak to her at all. He had come to Hartwell House because Lord Drayton had said it would be a quiet afternoon, and because Drayton's definition of quiet usually meant fewer than 40 people, which by the standards of the season constituted almost solitude. But the chair beside her was empty, and the chair beside Lady Clarissa Holt was not, and the distance between those two facts was sufficient. He sat. She looked at him with the mild, undisturbed expression of a woman who had not spent the last 3 years memorizing his habits, tracking his movements through ballrooms, or calculating the precise value of his estate in Wiltshire. She looked at him the way one looks at a person who is sat down. "You are Lord Drayton's friend," she said. Not a question. I am. He speaks of you with the particular weariness of a man who has given up trying to improve someone he is fond of. Hadrian, who had been spoken to with flattery by 9 women of impeccable breeding and considerable beauty, felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately identify. Later, he would recognize it as interest. At the time, he mistook it for surprise. "And you are Mrs. Palliser's sister?" "I am. She speaks of me with the particular fondness of a woman who believes I ought to marry, and the particular frustration of one who cannot persuade me to try." This was, in its way, a door. He did not walk through it. He sat beside it. They spoke for 11 minutes. He knew this because the clock on the mantelpiece chimed the quarter hour as he sat down, and the half hour just after she said the thing that would rearrange his life entirely. In those 11 minutes, she told him nothing of consequence. The condition of the roads in Hertfordshire, the inadequacy of London chimney sweeps, her opinion of the new plantings in Hyde Park, which she found optimistic but structurally unsound. She asked him nothing about his title, his estate, his income, his intentions, or his views on marriage. It was the most interesting conversation he had had in 3 years. The 9 refusals were, by then, the settled mythology of the ton. Every drawing room had its version. The first had been Lady Venetia Sefton, whose family had been so certain of success that they had already commissioned the wedding silver. The Duke of Selborne's letter, 4 lines, courteous, final, had arrived on the same day as the fish forks. Lord Sefton had read it aloud at dinner, convinced it was a formality, a preamble to terms. His wife had understood it before he finished the second line. The silver was quietly returned to the silversmith on Bond Street, who accepted it with the professional discretion of a man accustomed to the wreckage of social ambition. The second had been the eldest Hathaway girl. The third, a baron's daughter from Gloucestershire, whose name was already half forgotten because the rejection had come so swiftly that society had scarcely had time to learn it. The fourth and fifth had been presented in the same season, which gave the ton the pleasant sensation of watching the same door close twice. By the 6th refusal, mothers had begun to speak of the Duke of Selborne as one speaks of a geographical obstacle, something to be mapped and avoided rather than conquered. By the 9th, Lady Clarissa Holt, who had been the most beautiful and the most certain, the consensus had hardened into fact. The Duke of Selborne would not marry. He was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply, immovably, not interested. What none of them knew, what Lord Drayton suspected but had never been able to confirm, was that Hadrian had refused them all for the same reason, though he could not have articulated it himself. Each of them had arrived already knowing what they wanted from the marriage, the estate, the title, the London house, the standing. They had studied him the way one studies a position to be filled, and their proposals, or their father's proposals, or the delicate maneuvers that amounted to the same thing, had carried the unmistakable quality of a transaction completed before it had begun. They had already decided who he was. He had merely been asked to confirm it. He had said no 9 times because 9 times he had been offered a mirror, and 9 times he had not recognized the man in it. He did not know this about himself. He knew only that something was missing, and that the word for it was not beauty, and was not breeding, and was not the particular way Lady Clarissa Holt had looked at him across the Sefton ballroom with an expression calibrated to the nearest degree of warmth. At 27 minutes past 3, Kitty Wren set her untouched tea on the sill, turned to him with the composed, unperforming expression she had worn since he sat down, and said something about marriage. Not about his marriages. The proposed ones, the refused ones, the ones the Ton had constructed for him in absentia. About marriage itself, as a concept, as a thing she had observed. I think, she said, with the tone of someone finishing a thought she had begun before he arrived, that most people marry a version of the other person they have already decided upon and spend the rest of their lives defending the decision. I should not like to be decided upon. I should like to be known, simply known, even the inconvenient parts, especially those. She said it to the window, not to him. She said it the way one says something true that one has stopped expecting anyone to hear. She was not performing honesty. She was merely honest, in the way that people are honest when they do not believe they are being listened to. Hadrian looked at her for 4 seconds. "Then marry me," he said. The drawing room did not go silent. That was the later version, the one that improved upon reality. Mrs. Palliser, who was standing close enough to have heard, went still. Lord Drayton, who was standing 2 feet further, watched his oldest friend's face with the careful attention of a man witnessing something he had waited years to see. Kitty turned from the window. She looked at him. There was no blush, no flutter, no practiced display of surprise. She looked at him the way one looks at a person who has said something unexpected in a language one did not know they spoke. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Marry me." "We have known each other for 11 minutes. "Yes." She studied him. Her eyes, gray, steady, unsentimental, moved across his face with the unhurried precision of a woman who made her assessments slowly and did not revise them for convenience. "You are serious," she said. "Entirely." She picked up her tea. She took the first sip she had taken since he sat down. She set it back on the sill. "I was not proposing," she said. "I know. I was speaking generally about marriage as an institution." "I understood. And you are, responding specifically." "Yes." Lord Drayton, who had watched Hadrian refuse 9 women with varying degrees of elegance and identical degrees of finality, leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. He had never seen Hadrian's hands shake before. They were shaking now, very slightly. Enough. Kitty Wren was 24. She was the second daughter of Sir Philip Wren, a baronet of modest means, whose estate in Hertfordshire produced enough to maintain his family in comfort and not enough to launch his daughters into the kind of season that ended in ducal proposals. Her elder sister Frances had married Mr. Palliser, a good match, a comfortable match, the kind of match that did not generate gossip because there was nothing to generate. Kitty had come to London for a month to help Frances with the new baby and to attend the edges of the season without being consumed by its center. She had not come to be seen. She had not come to be chosen. She had come because her sister had asked, and because the baby had colic, and because London in May was preferable to Hertfordshire in mud season. But only just. She was not beautiful in the way the Ton measured beauty, not in the way Lady Clarissa Holt was beautiful, which was the way a painting is beautiful, composed and deliberate and aware of the light. Kitty was, and this was the word Hadrian would use later, when pressed, clear. Her face had the quality of a window cleaned so thoroughly that one forgot the glass was there. She did not perform. She simply was. Her features were regular without being remarkable, her figure slight, her coloring the kind of English fair that did not announce itself across rooms. What distinguished her, what had distinguished her since she was a child reading in her father's library while her elder sister practiced scales in the drawing room, was the quality of her attention. When Kitty looked at something, she saw it. Not the version of it that was convenient or flattering or expected. The thing itself. He had proposed to her in a drawing room full of people who had spent 3 years watching him refuse everyone, and she had responded by correcting his interpretation of her remarks. He found this, and he recognized the absurdity, even as he felt it, magnificent. The days that followed were unlike anything the Ton had witnessed from the Duke of Selborne. He called on Mrs. Palliser's house in Wimpole Street the following morning. Kitty received him in the front parlor with her sister's baby on her shoulder, and the expression that suggested she had been expecting him, but only in the way one expects weather. "I want to be clear," she said before he had finished sitting down. "I did not come to London looking for a husband. I did not come to Hartwell House looking for a wife. Then we are both poorly prepared. Or precisely prepared." She adjusted the baby on her shoulder with the practiced competence of a woman who had been managing small, unreasonable creatures her entire life, younger cousins, her father's hunting dogs, and now this infant who would not sleep unless held at a specific angle that defied all published advice on the subject. "Your Grace, Hadrian. Your Grace," she repeated with the particular emphasis of a woman establishing terms. "You refused Lady Venetia Sefton. You refused Lady Clarissa Holt. You refused 9 women, several of whom I have met, and all of whom are more accomplished, more beautiful, and more suited to your position than a baronet's daughter from Hertfordshire who was holding a colicky baby when you arrived. Yes, that does not trouble you? Not remotely." She looked at him with the same steady, unsentimental gaze she had turned on him in the drawing room. He met it. He did not look away. Most men, confronted with Kitty Wren's direct attention, developed a sudden interest in the furnishings. Hadrian sat in it the way one sits in sunlight. "Why?" she said. He had thought about this. He had thought about it for the entire walk from Brook Street to Wimpole Street, which was not long enough to arrive at a satisfactory answer and far too long to pretend the question did not exist. "Because you told me what you wanted from marriage without wanting it from me. You did not look at me and see Selborne. You looked at me and saw a man sitting in an empty chair. It was the only chair available." "Precisely." She almost smiled. He saw it, the faintest movement at the corner of her mouth, controlled before it arrived, like a letter written and folded before the ink was dry. He would learn, over time, that this was how Kitty expressed delight, not in the full, generous way the world expected of women, but in small, precise movements that one had to be watching to catch. He was watching. 3 days later, he proposed properly. He had consulted Lord Drayton, who had suggested flowers. He had consulted his housekeeper, Mrs. Netherwood, who had suggested he wear something other than his riding clothes. He had consulted his steward Kellaway, who had said nothing because Kellaway's genius lay in managing 6,000 acres, not in romantic counsel. And he had the wisdom to know the difference. Hadrian arrived at Wimpole Street at 11 in the morning. He wore his best coat, dark blue, cut by Weston, the kind of coat that cost more than Sir Philip Wren's annual income from sheep, and communicated without words that the man inside it was serious. He carried no flowers because flowers, upon reflection, seemed like the kind of gesture one made when the gesture was the point, and the gesture was not the point. He found Kitty in the garden. It was a small garden, brick-walled, south-facing, the kind of garden that London townhouses maintain as a gesture toward the country they have left behind. A pear tree occupied the far corner, heavy with white blossom that had begun to drop onto the gravel path. Kitty sat on a wooden bench beneath it, her feet tucked under her skirt, a book open on her lap. She wore a morning dress of sprigged muslin, and there were petals in her hair that she had not noticed or had not bothered to remove. She looked up. "Miss Wren," he said. He had rehearsed this. He had rehearsed it on the walk, which was long enough this time because he had taken the route through the park. "I have thought about what you said at Hartwell House. I have thought about little else. I'm asking you, properly, formally, in full awareness of the brevity of our acquaintance and the improbability of this moment, to marry me." She closed her book. She placed it on the bench beside her. She looked at him, the dark blue coat, the serious expression, the hands that were not shaking this time because he had willed them still. And she laughed, not cruelly, not dismissively. She laughed the way one laughs when the world presents something so genuinely, purely unexpected that the body responds before the mind can intervene. It was a real laugh, short, bright, startled out of her before she could catch it. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened. "Forgive me," she said immediately. I did not mean—" "You laughed." "I did. I'm sorry. It is only, you are standing in my sister's garden in a coat that costs more than our stable, asking me to be a duchess, and I was reading a treatise on crop rotation." "Is that amusing?" "It is. Unlikely. In the way that eclipses are unlikely. One knows they happen. One does not expect to be standing in the path." He looked at her. The laugh had done something to her face, opened it, the way a room opens when curtains are pulled back. She was looking at him with genuine warmth and genuine bewilderment, and not a trace of the calculation he had seen in 9 other faces across 3 years. "I'm going to ask you again," he said. "Now? Now." He did not kneel. He did not reach for her hand. He stood exactly where he was, in the improbable coat, in the small garden behind a terraced house in Wimpole Street, and he said, "Kitty, will you marry me?" He did not phrase it as a question. He said it the way one says something that has already been decided by forces larger than the people involved, the way one says the sun has risen or the tide has turned. She did not laugh. She looked at him for a long time. The garden was quiet. Somewhere inside the house, the baby was crying, and Frances was singing something off-key, and a door was closing. "Yes," she said. "Yes? I will not say it a third time." He sat down on the bench beside her. The treatise on crop rotation was between them. He did not move it. A petal from the pear tree drifted down and landed on the open page. Neither of them brushed it away. "You refused 9 women," she said after a moment. "I did. And you are choosing me." "I am not choosing you. I am recognizing you. There is a difference." She looked at him sidelong. The almost smile appeared again, the controlled, precise movement at the corner of her mouth. "That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, "and also the strangest. I am comfortable with both." They sat in the garden for another hour. He told her about Selborne Park, the house, the grounds, the tenant farms that ran along the river valley, the library that his grandfather had built and his father had neglected and he had restored, because a house without books was, to his mind, a house without weather. She told him about Hertfordshire, her father's barley, her sister's wedding, the winter she had read the entirety of Gibbon and emerged in spring convinced that all empires were temporary, but well-managed estates could last. He laughed. She noted this with the mild surprise of a woman who had not expected to make a duke laugh, and the quiet pleasure of a woman who found she wanted to do it again. The tongue received the news the way a body receives a shock, first numbness, then pain, then the long, exhausting process of adjustment. The Duke of Selborne, who had refused Lady Venetia Sefton and her wedding silver, who had refused the eldest Hathaway girl and her 12,000 a year, who had refused Lady Clarissa Holt and her face that launched 1,000 watercolors, the Duke of Selborne was marrying a baronet's daughter from Hertfordshire. A woman no one had heard of. A woman who had not been presented. A woman who, it was reported by Mrs. Palliser's cook to the Sefton housekeeper, and thence to every kitchen in Mayfair, had been holding a baby when the Duke first called. Lady Clarissa bore it with the rigid grace of a woman who had been trained from birth to smile through catastrophe. Lady Venetia bore it less well. The eldest Hathaway girl, who had since married a perfectly adequate viscount, bore it with the satisfaction of one who has survived a narrow escape. Lord Drayton bore it with something very close to relief. "I had begun to worry," he told Hadrian over brandy at the club, "that you were going to refuse everyone until you were 80 and leave the whole question to a second cousin in Norfolk. The second cousin in Norfolk is an imbecile. Hence my concern." The wedding was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a Tuesday morning in late June. The church was full. Every family that had offered a daughter to the Duke of Selborne was represented, seated, watching, performing the particular brand of generosity that society demands of the defeated. Kitty wore white muslin with a spencer of pale gold silk, and she walked the aisle with her father's arm and an expression of composed, undisturbed calm that made Lady Clarissa Holt grip her prayer book until her gloves creased. Sir Philip Wren, who had received the Duke's letter requesting permission to marry his daughter with the stunned silence of a man who has been informed that his modest Hertfordshire estate has somehow produced a duchess, sat in the front pew and wept quietly into his handkerchief. He was not a man given to displays of emotion, but the sight of Kitty, his Kitty, who had read more books than any woman he knew, and who could assess a field of barley at a glance, and who had never, not once, adjusted herself to fit someone else's expectation of who she ought to be, standing beside a duke who looked at her as though she were the only clear thing in a room full of noise. This undid him, gently and completely. The marriage settled into itself the way a house settles, with small shifts and adjustments, the creak of 2 lives finding how they fit. Selborne Park, the Duke's seat in Wiltshire, was a house built for ceremony, and Kitty moved through it with the quiet, unself-conscious authority of a woman who understood that running a great estate was not so different from running a small one, only the numbers were larger and the staff more numerous. Mrs. Netherwood, who had served the Duke's mother and had maintained the household through 3 years of refused proposals with the stoic patience of a woman who had seen worse, recognized in the new Duchess something she had not expected: competence without performance. Kitty did not sweep through rooms. She moved through them. She learned the names of every servant within a fortnight and the names of their children within a month, not because it was expected of a duchess, but because she was interested, and her interest was not a tool she deployed, but a quality she possessed. Kellaway, the steward, discovered that the new duchess could read a land survey. This was not a skill he had anticipated. It was, however, a skill he came to rely upon, because Kitty's eye for drainage was, he confided to Mrs. Netherwood over their evening tea, better than most of the surveyors he had hired, and she had the additional advantage of not charging by the hour. Hadrian watched her. He had spent 3 years refusing women who wanted to be Duchess of Selborne, and now the Duchess of Selborne was a woman who read treatises on crop rotation and corrected his steward's calculations and fell asleep in the library with her cheek on a page of agricultural reports. He found that marriage, which he had avoided with such determined thoroughness, was not the thing he had been avoiding. The thing he had been avoiding was pretense, and Kitty did not pretend. She did not pretend to find his silences uncomfortable. She did not pretend to enjoy the social obligations of the season more than she did. She did not pretend that the 9 refusals did not hang in the air of every ballroom they entered. She acknowledged them quietly, with the steady gaze of a woman who knew she had not been anyone's first choice and was not troubled by it, because being chosen 9th did not diminish the choosing. On evenings when the rain came in from the west and the house drew into itself, they sat in the library, she on the settee with her correspondence, he in the wing chair with whatever Kellaway had left for him, and they were silent together with the easy, unhurried silence of 2 people who did not require conversation to feel accompanied. Sometimes she read aloud, a passage from a novel, a particularly absurd letter from her father about the state of his fences, and sometimes he listened and sometimes he did not, and she did not mind either way, because she was not reading for him. She was reading because she wished to, and he was there because he wished to be, and the overlap of those 2 wishes was the architecture of the marriage. What she did not know, what he did not tell her, because he did not have the words yet, was that she had not been chosen 9th. She had been chosen first. Every refusal had been a refusal of something that was not her, before he knew what she was. He had been saying no to the wrong thing 9 times, and when the right thing appeared, sitting by a window with a cup of cold tea, speaking about marriage to no one in particular, he had known it the way one knows the ground, not by thinking about it, but by standing on it. They attended the Sefton ball in November. This was understood by everyone to be a test. Lady Venetia's family and the Duke's new wife, in the same room, under the same chandeliers, observed by every pair of eyes that had followed the saga of the 9 refusals from its beginning. Kitty dressed carefully, a gown of dove-gray silk with ivory lace at the collar, simple and unadorned, the kind of dress that communicated nothing except taste. Hadrian wore black. They arrived together, they entered together. The room, which had been at full volume, dropped to the particular hush that London employs when it wants to watch without appearing to. Let Lady Venetia approach them. This was brave. This was also calculated, because Lady Venetia understood that the only thing worse than being the first woman refused by the Duke of Selborne was being seen to mind it. "Your Grace," she said to Kitty, with a curtsy that was precisely calibrated, deep enough for a duchess, shallow enough for a rival. "How lovely to meet you at last." "Lady Venetia," Kitty's voice was warm and even, "I've heard a great deal about you. All of it true, I hope. All of it kind." This was a lie, and both of them knew it, and neither of them minded, because this was how women in their world conducted warfare, with courtesy so precise, it became a kind of respect. Lady Venetia's gaze moved across Kitty's face, down her gown and back, the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a woman taking the measure of someone who had succeeded where she had failed. Whatever she found there, the composure, the steadiness, the absence of triumph, it did not satisfy her, but it did not offend her either. She inclined her head. "You must come to dinner," Lady Venetia said, "next Thursday. We should be delighted." "We should be honored," Kitty replied, and meant it exactly as much as Lady Venetia had meant the invitation, which was precisely enough, and not a syllable more. The room exhaled. Hadrian danced the first dance with his wife. He danced the second with Lady Clarissa, because Lord Drayton had suggested this, and because Hadrian understood, in the way he was beginning to understand, social mechanics, since marrying a woman who navigated them without effort, that this was a necessary kindness. He danced the third dance with Kitty again, and the fourth. By the fifth, Lord Drayton leaned against a pillar and observed to no one in particular that the Duke of Selborne, who had spent 3 years refusing every woman in London, now appeared incapable of releasing one. The season closed. They returned to Wiltshire. The months that followed had the quality of a house with all its windows open, light moving through every room, the particular warmth of two people who had stopped performing and begun simply living. Kitty read in the mornings, Hadrian rode, they met at luncheon and again at dinner, and in the hours between, the house filled with the small, ordinary sounds of a marriage that was working. Her laughter from the library, his boots in the hall, Mrs. Netherwood humming in the kitchen corridor because the house, after 3 years of waiting, finally felt like a house again. In spring, their daughter was born. They named her Frances, after Kitty's sister. Hadrian held her in the first hour and did not speak for a long time, and Kitty, watching him from the bed with the exhausted clarity of a woman who has just accomplished something extraordinary, saw on his face an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful composure he wore in public, not the quiet warmth he showed her in private, but something beneath both of those, something unguarded and raw and too large for the room. "You are staring," she said. "I am." "At which one of us?" "Both. Either. I cannot seem to stop." The years accumulated. Frances grew. A son followed, Philip, for Kitty's father. Selborne Park settled into its fullness, every room occupied, every corridor carrying the sound of children and dogs and the particular chaos that descends upon a house that has stopped being a monument and become a home. Hadrian took his seat in the House of Lords when the session required it, spoke rarely, voted carefully, and returned to Wiltshire with the undisguised relief of a man who preferred his own fields to any chamber in Westminster. Kitty oversaw the estate through Kellaway with a competence that had become the quiet scandal of the county, not because a duchess should not understand land management, but because this particular duchess understood it better than most of the gentlemen who dined at her table. She did not advertise this. She did not need to. The tenants knew. Kellaway knew. Hadrian knew and loved her for it, and had stopped being surprised by it, because surprise requires expectation, and he had learned that expecting Kitty to be anything other than exactly what she was amounted to, a failure of attention he was no longer willing to commit. Mrs. Netherwood retired the year Philip was born, replaced by a young woman from the village whom Kitty trained herself. At the farewell dinner in the servants' hall, Mrs. Netherwood said to Kellaway, in the private voice she reserved for truths she had earned the right to speak, "I served his mother for 20 years. I would have served this one for 40. The moment that would complete the story, the one that circled back to the beginning and sealed it, came at a dinner 7 years after the wedding. The table held 12. Among them was a young man, newly arrived in society, who had heard the legend of the 9 refusals, but had not yet met its principles. He sat near the foot of the table, close enough to the Duke to ask what he had clearly been wanting to ask all evening, and young enough not to know that some questions are better left to silence. "Your Grace," he said during a lull between courses, "I hope you will forgive the impertinence, but I have heard the story of the 9 refusals, and I have wondered, everyone wonders really." "Why her?" Hadrian said. His voice was patient. He had heard the question before. He did not mind it. "Yes, why her when you had said no to everyone else?" The table quieted. Not dramatically, not with the held-breath silence of a room expecting a revelation. Quietly. The way a room quiets when it senses that something true is about to be said. Hadrian looked down the table at Kitty. She was not looking at him. She was speaking to the woman beside her, her head tilted slightly, her gray eyes attentive, her hands still. She was wearing a gown of deep blue, the color she had worn more and more as she grew into the role that had never been a role at all, and the candlelight caught the line of her jaw and the faint curve of her mouth and the composure that had undone him in a drawing-room 7 years ago, between one sip of tea and the next. She was not trying, he said. 3 words. The young man waited for more. There was no more. At the other end of the table, Kitty's conversation paused. She had heard. She looked at him, down the length of silver and crystal and candlelight, and the almost smile appeared, the controlled, precise movement at the corner of her mouth that he had spent 7 years learning to watch for. She had heard it before. He had said it before, to Drayton, to Mrs. Netherwood, to Sir Philip, to the reflection in his shaving mirror on mornings when the house was quiet and the gratitude arrived without warning. She was not trying. She never had been. And he had spent 9 refusals learning to recognize the difference. They arrive here like a question asked twice and answered once whenever they are ready.